I've worked on so many games that I have never finished. Some of them were prototypes and others had months of work put into them, but then life happened. Classes, work, or whatever else was going on at the time, and those games ultimately got abandoned. But every once in a while, I think about them, and I ask myself the same question. Why didn't these games ever get finished? In 2025, over 20,000 games were released on Steam. That's a giant collection of huge AAA releases, indie games, passion projects, and everything in between. But every single one of those games represents an enormous amount of work. But it really makes you think about all of those games that didn't make it. The dream projects. The ones that people started, but never actually made it to the finish line. And the more I thought about all of my unfinished games, I realized something. From what I've seen, there's one mistake that almost all unfinished games have in common. And that reason is how willing you are to let your game change. But that reason is a lot bigger than it sounds, so I want to start by breaking it down and talking specifically about the idea. It is very easy to get carried away with your game ideas and try and design your entire game in one night. But the issue with that is games are iterative. They constantly evolve and shape into their final form, and what you think is fun might not be what other people think is fun. Let's look at Celeste, for example. Celeste is an insanely successful platformer known for its super tight and satisfying controls, its beautiful world, and its journey about self-discovery. A game this well put together feels like they had it all mapped out before they even started developing, but that's not the case at all. Celeste actually started out as a simple project for the Pico 8 Game Jam. Now Celeste looks a little bit different in this version, but that's because it was made in 4 days on a very simple and limited engine. And even though it's so simple, it was extremely satisfying and well received. People loved and praised its simple yet addictive design, and because of that, they decided to make it a full-on game. And since then, it's become one of the most popular platformers of all time. But after porting the game over to Nintendo Switch, one of the lead developers, Noel Berry, was asked this question: was there anything you experimented with but ultimately left out? In which they responded, yes. Basically every chapter in the game had ideas, mechanics, art, and levels that were eventually thrown out. I think that when making a game, you have to be alright with throwing things out, especially when they don't really end up matching the vision. It's not lost work or time, it's part of the process of coming to the final realization of the game. Of course, they knew the type of game that they were making and had ideas for mechanics and stories, but they let a lot of this evolve and grow while they were developing the game instead of locking in everything at the start. And it is really hard to let go of ideas, especially when you've already spent so much time working on them. And whether that work was just some ideation or actual prototyping work that went into the game, it is really hard to let go of your ideas. But that brings up the next part of being flexible in development. When should you be flexible? When do you finally decide that you have to pivot your ideas? And how do you prevent sinking way too much time into something that's not going to end up in the final game? Obviously, if you have a game idea, making a quick prototype of it to see if it's fun is the best way to test it out before deciding to make it a full-on game. But what about after that? Once you've already decided that this is a good idea and you're expanding it out, how do you keep on treating every single step of your development as a prototype that you can keep on iterating on? That, my friend, is where Agile comes in. Wait, that sounds like a sponsor. No, it's not a sponsor. Agile is a project management framework that's used all the time in software development. There's a ton of great videos on Agile that I'll link in the description if you want to learn about it in depth, but the whole idea around it is that instead of planning out your entire project at the start, you break your development into short, focused chunks of time called sprints. A sprint is just a small development cycle of 1, 2 to maybe 4 weeks, and at the end of each sprint, you have something that's testable. It doesn't need to be perfect, just testable. And the best part about a sprint is if you test something at the end of your sprint and it just doesn't feel like it's working, you can change it right then instead of waiting 3 or 4 months when you're in way too deep. These sprints also have hard deadlines, which means you have to be willing to pivot and be flexible during a sprint in order to meet those deadlines. You set that main thing that you're trying to test out and then figure out every single task that needs to be completed so that your main goal can be testable by a specific date. And if you aren't going to meet that date, then you have to figure out how to change or pivot so that you can still meet that deliverable. This ensures that your game is constantly growing and changing during development instead of having to make major changes or giving up entirely multiple months into it. I mean, look at a game jam, for example. These are essentially small sprints where you're trying to make an entire game. It's that pressure of having to prioritize, compromise, and be flexible that allows people to make such awesome games in such short time frames. You can't spend too long working on something or else you won't finish the game in time. And in the case of a team of developers I know, this is exactly what they faced in a 6-week game challenge they took part in. So without further ado, Ending Machine, take it away.
am a vending machine.
Hi, I'm Riley McMillan. Did you know you're more likely to be killed by a vending machine than by a shark? In our game Ending Machine, you play as a killer vending machine determined to keep those numbers up. This game was part of a 10-week long challenge where we had to make a game about a fun fact. After spending a week or two working on a few ideas that just didn't feel right, we landed on this fact about vending machines. We were quick to start work on the game, but then we hit a snag. Busy schedules. We had an idea, but then we let it collect dust for weeks. We eventually had time to sit down and work on the game when spring break came along. We got our basic design done quickly and got a lot of technical concerns out of the way. We were a bit behind and had a long way to go, but this thing was really starting to take shape. Then classes started again and the game was banished back to the basement to rot. So even though we started with 10 weeks, when we finally got back around to the project, all we had was 1 week left. And only a basic tech demo. We considered throwing in the towel and stepping out of the competition. How could we possibly finish with only 1 week left? But then one of us pointed out that game devs actually work on tight deadlines all the time, during game jams. We'd all done game jams in the past. If we could make it work then, why couldn't we do it again now? So we all got together and decided to make this thing happen in 1 week. So now, with an incredibly tight deadline, we got to work. Once we got going, a lot of things actually really started to fall into place. Our programmer was working well, level design was pretty quick, and our simple style allowed for quick asset creation. But then, when everything seemed to be going our way, we encountered a pretty big hurdle. You see, we were down to just 1 day left. We realized one of our core mechanics wasn't even in the game yet, the sharks. In our game, you're not just killing a bunch of innocent bystanders as fast as possible. You're actually competing with sharks to see who can kill them the fastest. After all, the sharks are about half of the original fun fact the whole game is based on. Initially, we'd imagined the sharks jumping out of the water on one side of the dock, snatching up their human, and landing in the water back on the other side. However, this created a few problems. First, there's a lot of people in our game. Each would need to be able to be snatched up by a shark and pulled into the water, no exception. So we'd need a replicable mechanic. We could just use a single arc that travels even the widest sections of deck in the game, and then use that everywhere, but that brings us to our second problem. The deck in some places is actually very wide, and there are often various objects that act as obstacles on either side of the player in the dock. Not to mention, the player themselves would also be acting as an obstacle, as we didn't really want the sharks attacking the player, but only the people on the dock. Whatever system we ended up with, these sharks would need to be able to avoid these obstacles and still reach their targets, which wasn't possible in many places. We could make the arc an editable variable per human character and change it on an individual basis. There are nearly 100 humans in the game right now, and that would take way too long. We all agreed that this mechanic was a must-have, so we had no choice but to redesign it in a way that fit our time constraint. After an hour of peaceful group meditation, we'd solved it. What if the sharks didn't arc across the deck at all, but instead came up from under the deck, destroying it in the process? Not only was this a very fun visual, but it also meant that humans could be placed anywhere and almost always be reachable by the shark. This introduced the need to be careful with placement, as any location that a human could be needed to be able to be destroyed by a shark, and we didn't want to hard lock the player. Fortunately, it didn't take long to resolve this, and in no time we were back on track. In the end, the time constraint may have forced us to rethink a mechanic, but having to scope that mechanic down actually created an unexpected, dare I say better mechanic. And in terms of everything else we set out to do, making a single long level that started in the city and ended on the docks? Check. With all our core mechanics? Check. Cute stylized art assets? Check. And a killer soundtrack? Check and check. In the end, our willingness to be flexible and simplify our game helped make sure we finished it. We almost gave up, but if we had, we wouldn't have won that competition. Our perseverance drove us to work around issues, even when it felt like compromising on our creative vision. Once we were on the other side of all those changes, we often found they actually improved the game. Deadlines can feel scary sometimes. They can even make things feel hopeless, make you want to give up. However, it's deadlines that drive us to make good games. We procrastinated, worked on a time crunch, and had to scope our game down a lot. But we got everything the game needed finished, managed to win that competition, and got the game out on itch so people can actually play it. When the odds were stacked against us, we got the game done.
Now, you don't need to rush your game or stress yourself out like crazy to get it done, but get in a rhythm. Make sure you're testing your game all the time and showing it to your friends, letting them test it. Because the second you leave that rhythm, or you realize that you're going to have to redo weeks or months of development, is the second that your game is going to become less of a priority and you might just leave it behind forever. Know your skill level, make small games while you're figuring things out, and don't be afraid to make a million prototypes for ideas that you have. But once you have that game that you're so excited about and you want to share it with the world, make sure to test it and let it evolve into the best game it can possibly be. Big thanks to Ending Machine for telling their story, and now a lot of the members on that team are working on a new game and asked if you guys could check it out. I've linked their Steam page in the description if you want to go and give them a wish list. Also, this is a new series I'm playing around with where I'm bringing in other developers to talk about their experiences, so let me know what you thought of it down in the comments. Anywho, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!